Right, well, good afternoon. The purpose of the talk this afternoon, you have to excuse me because my throat's gone. The purpose of the talk this afternoon is to talk about how we develop an aircraft and flight simulator, and I'm going to do that in the context of developing the 747. So, what do we do first when we first look at an aircraft? Well, first of all, we decide which aircraft we're going to do. Various factors, popularity, is it an aircraft that people are going to get enjoyment from flying? Is it going to be too hard to fly? Is it going to be interesting for people who like deeper systems, simulations, and that kind of thing? Once we've done that, the next task is, well, how do we produce it? So we typically start by getting the flight manual for the aircraft, any technical manuals that we can find, maintenance manuals, anything that will help us understand how the aircraft operates. So we study those, and then the other thing that we do is we look at the aircraft itself. A good starting point is the flight engineers panel. So on the 747, as you can see, there's a lot going on. Broadly, a lot of aircraft have got a lot of commonality, as many of you I'm sure are aware. So you've got hydraulic systems, you've got pneumatic systems, obviously you've got engines, fuel system, and so on. Different aircraft handle those systems in different ways. So the challenge with developing an aircraft is, where do you begin? Well, at the basis of all systems are the engines. So one of the first things that we develop is the engine model. We work on the startup and the shutdown and the engine parameters. So we've got a basic engine that works. On something like 747, you've also got an auxiliary power unit, which can also supply various services to the aircraft. So again, you've got electrical and pneumatic, can also be supplied by the APU. So in the case of the 747, what I did was I developed the APU first. It's much simpler than an engine in terms of how much depth that we need to go to actually make it operate, whilst supplying the services that we need to drive the rest of the aircraft. So in this case of 747, we started with the engine instruments first. So we looked at engine startup, shutdown, what are the parameters doing, how are the parameters doing, behaving when the engine starts up, shuts down, and that kind of thing. And then we go ahead and we program an engine model. So I started first of all with the engine instruments at the top is the N2 turbine, which is the power turbine of the engine. And then from that, it drives all the other parameters. So once the engine's running, and here it's in the idle state, various things happen. People probably don't initially see some of the detail that goes into the systems at this level. But for example, the engine oil quantity, as the engine spools up and it starts pumping oil around the engine as it runs, the oil quantity actually reduces slightly because the engine has come out of the reservoir and is being pumped around the engine, so it doesn't actually register as being in the sump anymore. So one of the things that happens is the oil quantity drops. So that's part of the simulation. Another thing is the oil pressure and the temperature. When the engine RPM comes up, the oil pressure necessarily increases as well in order to circulate around the engine. And that in turn raises the oil temperature. So as part of that, you've got the relationship between oil pressure, the speed of the turbine between shutdown and idle. It's fairly constant between idle and sort of a mid-range power, and then the pressure increases slightly as you get towards high power. And then that in turn drives the oil temperature. So the modelling behind that is essentially, well, how long has the engine been running? It's been running for 3 or 4 minutes. What's the ambient temperature when we started? And then it ramps the oil temperature up in a realistic way to simulate how the oil temperature would rise based upon ambient conditions and how long the engine's been running and at what power setting. On the 747 specifically, you'll notice at the bottom there's a row of instruments called breather temp. That's actually quite an interesting feature. The way the engine is designed, along the turbine shaft you've got various bearings. Around the 7th stage of the turbine, there's actually a gap between the turbine bearing and the casing. and it's within the turbine core after the combustion chamber. So the exhaust gases are extremely hot. They've just literally come out of the combustion chamber and they're going past the 7th stage bearing, and they can go into a gap that's between the bearing and the case. Because that's actually quite a critical region, and it can suffer an overtemp, which then results in bearing failure and then ultimately engine failure. They've got what's called a breather temp, which measures the air temperature in the gap between the bearing and the rest of the turbine, which is one of the more peculiar features of the 747 engine panel. It's not something you see very often on any aircraft at all, but that's what that's actually referencing, the temperature of the bearing and then the air gap that exists. And all that is modelled on the 74 Classic. The next step is, once you've got the engines, what do you do next? Well, we need electrical services. Most of the aircraft systems are electrical in some way, whether it's DC power for lighting or control panels, or AC electric to run the core systems, the actual avionics that are in the equipment bay. Need electrical power. So the next logical step is, well, okay, we've got the engines running, let's set up an electrical system. So we go through and study the schematics for the electrical system. We look at how it's constructed, relays, switches. We look at its overall functionality and operation. And then that results in the electrical simulation. So what we've got here, I've set up 4 states in the electrical system. We've got electrical systems from left to right, 1, 2, 3, and 4, for engines 1, 2, 3, and 4. The left generator is running, it's connected to the bus. Just bear in mind that this is a work in progress. So on this one, you can see generator 1 is selected on the voltage meter, and you can see the voltage being generated. The second engine is in the configuration of the generator being offline, and the field is tripped. What the field generator is, if you know anything about AC electric motors, they don't have a permanent magnet. The motors on these have got an AC magnet, which then forms the spinning core of the generator, which then generates the electric field. That's simulated here as well. It's not just a light that goes on and off and looks like a piece of eye candy. It actually simulates the residual current, as it's called, that goes through forgive me. Basically, the core of the generator, the stator, that generates the electric field that allows the generator to then generate its power. So all that's modeled. The third engine is showing the CSD is disconnected, so it's tripped the generator and the field as a consequence. And then the fourth one is showing that independently the bus tie breaker, which connects the generator set to the bus, can also be tripped independently. And all the buses behind that, that's just the generator functionality. Behind that is another 300 lines of code which simulate the 14 odd electrical buses of the aircraft. So in addition to the actual AC generator buses, you've got various buses for radio, DC, various DC buses. You've got 8 essential AC and DC buses. The selector for those are over here on the right-hand side. That's all modelled and works exactly as the real thing would. So that's the kind of detail that you're looking at. It looks like a few switches and a few lights, but behind the simulation is actually quite a lot of work. Slightly above that, you've got the external power, which again works in a very similar way. You've got the bus tie breaker, which splits the system left and right. So generators 1 and 2 are on the left, 3 and 4 are on the right. The external power is split left and right, so 1 is on the left, 2 is on the right. And the same with the APU generator, that splits in half as well, so 1 generator is on the left and 1 generator is on the right. And all of that is modelled within the simulation. The APU was one of the simpler systems to actually develop. It's essentially engine RPM, EGT, oil pressure, and then whether electrical services and pneumatics are available. And that functions exactly like the real thing. It also simulates the APU controller logic, so the APU can actually detect various states and function, again, accurately to the real thing. So when you shut down the APU and you switch the switch to stop, it's not just telling the simulator, right, stop running the engine. It actually sends a false, what's called a false condition to the engine controller for the APU, which then causes the APU shutdown. You don't actually shut down the APU, you actually generate a fault which causes the shutdown, which on the 747 is why you get the APU fault light when you select it from run to stop, because the APU genuinely believes that there is a fault, and that's why it's gone into the shutdown mode. The reason they did that was because back in the day when they developed the avionics for the APU controller, they didn't have the capacity to actually have a separate shutdown logic. So what they did is they just hijacked the fault logic for the shutdown. And that's simulated here in complete detail. After we've done the electrical system, the next thing that we need is pneumatics. So this is the pneumatic panel and the pressurization panel. The pneumatic panel is the upper half, and the pressurization panel is the lower half. So we're starting with the pneumatic system, takes bleed air off the engines, or the APU depending on configuration. And then that supplies pressure either to the engines or from the engines, depending on whether the engines are running or not. It also simulates the high stage bleed valve. Again, it's not a canned simulation. It does actually simulate the pressure based upon engine RPM, ambient conditions, and also whether the high stage bleed is open or closed. A nice little feature, which again is something that probably won't be noticed by too many people, is the engine performance is actually affected by whether or not the high stage bleeds are open or closed. Affects the total thrust output of the engine, which affects aircraft performance. Again, a detailed simulation that isn't outwardly visible through any switch or light, but is present within the simulation. Following on from the pneumatic simulation, you've got the pack simulation, which are the three switches at the top. The packs essentially take bleed air off the engine. It comes off the engine at about 560 degrees Celsius. The packs put it through a compressor. The temperature is reduced from 560 degrees right down to about -10 degrees, and then that's mixed with warm air, both recirculated and warm bleed air off the engines to produce the cabin temperature of about 20 degrees. And that's simulated again in the pack simulation model. And then following on from that is the pressurization model. Again, that's not canned. It actually simulates a pressure vessel, and it takes the ambient outside air pressure and it treats the fuselage as a closed tube with a variable outlet. So what it will do is the packs will produce an overpressure, and then that's balanced by how wide is the aperture of the outflow valve at the other end, which regulates the pressure that's within the fuselage itself. So as you increase altitude or decrease altitude of the aircraft, and you don't change the outflow valve position, then the aircraft will change its relative pressure to the outside world accordingly. If the outflow valves are open too much, as you get higher, what happens is the ambient pressure reduces. So imagine you're heading towards space. The atmospheric pressure reduces quite significantly up to 35,000 feet. But the pressure inside is constant. The delta pressure, as it's called, and that's measured on this instrument here called differential pressure. Measures the delta pressure between the fuselage and the outside air. That will increase. And then because of the relative density of the air, it's not simply about pressure, it's about density of the air as well. Because the density of the outside air is lower, in addition to the pressure, it means that the air that's inside the fuselage wants to escape faster out of the fuselage into the atmosphere. So that's why, consequently, when you climb the aircraft, if you watch the outflow valves on the pressurization system, certainly of a real aircraft, you will find as the aircraft climbs in altitude, the outflow valves close to reduce the size of the aperture so that less air is actually lost to the atmosphere. and it maintains cabin pressure. All of that is present here. Following on from the pressurization system, once you've got the air mixed and you pressurize the aircraft and you can change the temperature, you've got the temperature controllers, which again simulate the mixing of the air between the cold air at -10 produced by the packs directly. That's actually a fixed output, you can't change that. What you change is you change a trimmer which injects warm air into the cold air stream and mixes it and makes it the temperature that you desire. That's all controlled from this panel here, and that's all modelled in quite good detail as well. So it actually simulates the mixing of the air. Another feature that isn't apparent is, depending on whether you switch on certain fans like the toilet extractor fan of all things, that actually vents the air directly out of the toilet cubicle directly overboard. What I mean by that is there's actually a fan in the fuselage which goes straight from the toilet to the outside world. When that's switched on, that actually results in a cabin pressure drop of about a PSI. That's modelled here as well. Once we've got all the air systems and the engine systems, we then come to the hydraulics. That's key to operating things like the landing gear and flight controls. Again, it's 4 systems. They're all independent. Each has got an engine-driven pump and what's called an air-driven pump. The air-driven pump is literally a pneumatic pump that's fed off the bleed air system. So instead of it being directly driven by the engine gearbox, it's driven by the pneumatic bleed air that's produced by the engines. So it supplies an independent source of hydraulic power. They've got 2 modes of operation, an automatic mode and a continuous mode. In the automatic mode, it modulates the pressure between 2600 psi and 3200 psi. And in the continuous mode, it doesn't care for the pressure, it just runs the pump as long as there's pneumatic pressure available. Again, that's all modelled here, and you can see the lights modulating. The hydraulic system also accounts for surfaces that are taking hydraulic pressure, so as you move the flight controls, it has an impact on how much pressure is used, and that affects how much the pumps have to run to supply the pressure. And then following on from the hydraulic system, once that was all in place, we then went on and developed the brake system. So you've got the normal brake source select, system 1, which supplies the normal brake pressure, and then, system 4, which supplies the normal brake pressure, and then system 1, which supplies the backup. They take their primary pressures off the main hydraulics, but if the main hydraulics fail, they've got pressure accumulators for the brakes. So when you land, you've still got brakes. That's all simulated here as well, along with the hydraulic accumulators themselves. So the initial application of the brakes will run down the pressure slightly. When you release the brakes, that's a release of pressure from the braking system. It's not a release of pressure from the hydraulic system. So the pressure doesn't drop. And you've got approximately 5 applications of the brake before you consume all the pressure that's in the secondary system. Next major system that was developed was the fuel system. Obviously the engines and the AP need fuel at some point. So at that point the fuel system is developed. There's a few parts to it. Probably the most challenging part of this was to actually do the fuel crossfeed. The way the aircraft is configured, each wing tank through 1 through 4, gravity feeds the engine as long as the fuel valve is open. However, there is a secondary line which has a high pressure pump which also feeds fuel to the engine, but under pressure. When the pump is operating, because of the laws of physics, the high pressure essentially takes over from the gravity feed, and so the pump supplies the fuel pressure to the engine as long as it's operating. If the fuel pressure drops for any reason, the system naturally reverts to a gravity feed system without any intervention by the flight crew. The other part that was quite tricky initially was how to do the cross feed. Tank 1 feeds engine 1, but it can also feed engine 2, 3, and 4, depending on whether its fuel pumps are running and the cross feed valves are open. I've actually devised quite an interesting way of handling that. I do simulate all the fuel pumps and I do simulate all the crossfeed valves, but in terms of how the fuel is taken out of each tank, it's not quite as straightforward as well. That switch is on and that fuel valve is open, so therefore take the fuel out of the tank. I actually simulate the fuel in the fuel line to the engine, and I simulate the fuel in the crossfeed valve to the engine, in the crossfeed fuel line, that is, to the engine. And what I do is I go through a process of how much fuel did the engine burn in the last update, and then I take that fuel out of the respective tanks that are feeding their respective manifolds. And that results in actually quite a straightforward simulation of the fuel system, which is fully operational to the real thing. Another thing that I've added to this is you'll notice that the fuel temperature is set at minus 40 degrees. I simulate fuel icing. So when the aircraft is flying in really cold ambient conditions, it will simulate the fuel reducing in temperature and the formation of ice crystals within that fuel. You probably remember a few years ago a Boeing 777 had a problem after it flew over Siberia. It encountered ambient temperatures down at almost minus 70, and it was flying in those conditions for about 2.5 hours, and that reduced the fuel temperature to minus 38, which caused ice crystals to form in the fuel, and then when they came in for approaching Heathrow, they lost control of the engines. The primary reason that happened was because the oil fuel heat exchangers, when the engines were throttled back for the descent, there wasn't enough oil running through those exchangers to keep the temperature up sufficiently to keep the fuel warm, which was a problem there. That's all modelled here. The fuel heaters don't just switch on a light, they actually function. So when you're flying in cold conditions and the fuel temperature drops, you need to keep an eye on those and switch on the fuel heaters to stop the fuel freezing, otherwise you'll start flying with no engines on your aircraft. Other parts of the flight engineer panel, these are currently in process, so there's nothing functional right on these screenshots, but the logic behind them is written. You've got a lot of indicators across a large part of the flight engineer station, which shows various statuses of the landing gear trucks. So the landing gear on the 747, it tilts. When the aircraft's flying and is coming in for approach, the landing gear is tilted upwards at about 14 degrees. And then when the aircraft touches down, the truck's level as the weight comes on to better absorb the weight of the aircraft as it touches down on the runway. There's actually a series of sensors in the gear trucks which tell the position of those landing gear, whether the landing gear is tilted or level, and they're indicated on this indicator here. So you've got the gear tilt for the left wing and the left center. It also shows secondary indications for the main body gear and the nose gear independently. Each body gear has got a single light, as has the nose gear indication. You probably remember a very famous incident, I think it was Lockheed TriStar, that had a very, very simple landing gear indication. It was just simply gear up, gear down. There was no other indication on the flight deck. And they were coming in to land at, I think it was Miami International. They went to put the landing gear down, and they didn't get the light. And the flight crew got so focused on why the gear wasn't down, they ended up crashing into the Everglades. What it turned out to be was the light had failed in the instrument panel. So Boeing learned from that, and in the 747 they put in a lot of redundancy for the landing gear indicators. So as well as having the lights up front on the main panel for the pilots, the flight engineer can see the status of each individual landing gear leg, as well as the gear doors for each leg as well. The gear tilt matters because if the gear is not tilted when the gear is retracted, the gear will not go into the landing gear bay. Part of the reason the gear tilts is it reduces the width of the landing gear when it goes up into the fuselage. If the gear is not tilted, then what will happen is when the gear comes up, the wheels will hit the fuselage and make a big noise. So as part of checking if there's any fault with the landing gear system, part of that system is to check the tilt. It also affects the braking system as well. The anti-skid system is inoperative as long as the landing gear is tilted. It believes that the aircraft is still in the air and still flying, so the anti-skid system is deactivated. But once the landing gear is in a level position, in combination with the level position and the weight on wheels signal, the anti-skid is then activated, and then when the auto brakes activate, the anti-skid is there to control the deceleration. Otherwise, if it believes that any of the gear trips are not level, it thinks that the aircraft has landed slightly at an angle or is not on the ground, the anti-skid system won't operate, and consequently neither will the auto brake. So it's quite a critical system to the functioning of other parts of the aircraft. On the right-hand side, at the top right-hand side, there are two dials there. One is showing the gross aircraft weight, and the other one is showing percent MAC. MAC is mean aerodynamic chord. It shows you where the current C of G is of the aircraft. That's actually quite an interesting system. It actually uses a series of accelerometers to measure the aircraft in level flight. And based upon the current aircraft pitch and airspeed, true airspeed, it will measure the attitude of the aircraft, and from that it can determine how heavy it is and where the C of G is. Quite an incredible system. That operates on the ground when the aircraft is parked. It varies around, it measures the gear strip position. So the heavier the aircraft is, the more the gear compresses. And based upon how much the main gear is compressed versus how much the nose gear is compressed, it can calculate where the C of G is when it's parked as well. So it can tell you gross aircraft weight and the C of G position. Below that, you've got the anti-skid control, which again is functional because the anti-skid system is modelled. And then below that, you've got the indicators for the leading edge slats. They matter because the leading edge slats, they reduce the stalling speed of the wing when they're extended. If they're not deploying correctly, if you've got an asymmetric deployment, say for example the slats come out on the right wing but they don't come out on the left wing, what happens is you get an increase of lift on the right wing and not on the left wing, and the aircraft rolls quite sharply to the left. In some cases it can actually be severe enough. If you have a complete failure on one side of the aircraft, it can actually be an uncontrollable roll that the ailerons are not able to counteract. So the leading edge flat position indicator tells you which ones are extended, which ones aren't, so if there's a problem you can figure out what's going on. I think I'm running rapidly out of time. Yeah. As you can see, there's an awful lot going on in the simulation. I hope it's given you a good taste of what's to come. And I'm working like crazy to try and make it as good as possible. So I apologise for running slightly.
Thank you very much.